I never imagined my own flesh and blood would serve me with court papers. The manila envelope trembled in my hands as I read the accusation, disturbing their privacy. My son David was taking me to court because I had entered their home when I heard my 6-year-old granddaughter Jessica crying through an open window. What I found inside made me call social services immediately. Now David claims I am interfering with their parenting rights. At 67 years old, after sacrificing everything for my son, I found myself facing a legal battle against the very family I had given my life to protect. The thought of losing access to Jessica and little Ethan forever crushed my heart. The summons felt like a physical blow, sending me stumbling to the kitchen chair in my small apartment. The walls around me seemed to close in as memories flooded back. I remembered the day Jack, my husband, died of a sudden heart attack when David was just 10 years old. The doctors said it was a congenital condition nobody could have predicted. In an instant, I became both mother and father to our only son. Those early years were brutal. I worked as an elementary school secretary during the day and waited tables at night just to keep our modest home and put food on the table. David would often be asleep by the time I returned from my evening shift, and I'd sit by his bed, exhausted but grateful for his peaceful breathing. We had each other, and that seemed enough. "You're doing an amazing job, Eileen." My sister Carol would say during our Sunday dinners, the only luxury I allowed myself. "David is turning into such a fine young man." She wasn't wrong. Despite our struggles, David excelled in school. He was studious, focused, and determined to make something of himself. When he was accepted to Stanford Law School, I cried tears of joy and pride. The scholarship covered most expenses, but I took out a second mortgage on our home to handle the rest. "Mom, I promise I'll pay you back for everything," David said the day I drove him to campus. His eyes shone with sincerity and ambition. "Just be happy and make a good life," I told him. "That's all the repayment I need." And for a while it seemed he would keep that promise. David graduated with honors and landed a position at a prestigious law firm in Seattle. I watched with pride as he built his career, working his way up to becoming a corporate attorney with an impressive salary and reputation. Our weekly phone calls became monthly, then occasional, but I understood. He was busy building his life. Everything changed when he met Heather during a charity gala. She was stunning, with perfectly styled blonde hair and clothes that screamed old money, though I later learned her family had lost most of their fortune years before. They had a whirlwind romance, and 6 months later David called to tell me they were engaged. "She's the one, Mom," he said, his voice filled with an excitement I hadn't heard since he was a child unwrapping Christmas presents. The wedding was lavish, far beyond what I thought appropriate, but David insisted they needed to impress Heather's social circle. I sat in the front row in my carefully chosen dress from Macy's, feeling distinctly out of place among the designer outfits surrounding me. After the wedding, their visits became increasingly rare. When Jessica was born, I drove to Seattle every chance I got, eager to bond with my first grandchild. Heather was polite but distant, often finding reasons to cut my visit short. "She's just protective of the baby," David explained after I expressed my hurt feelings. "You know how new mothers can be." I did know, and I tried to be understanding. When Ethan arrived 2 years later, I resolved to be more respectful of their space, though it broke my heart to be kept at arm's length from my grandchildren. 3 years ago, David called with exciting news. They'd found their dream home in our hometown of Bellingham, but were struggling to meet the down payment. "We want the kids to grow up in a good community," he explained, "and it would be wonderful to have you nearby." Without hesitation, I offered to sell my house and give them the proceeds. The market was good, and I had built substantial equity over 30 years. The sale netted $350,000, all of which went to David and Heather. "We'll add your name to the deed once everything's settled," David promised. I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment just 15 minutes from their new 5-bedroom colonial. It was cramped compared to my old home, but the thought of being close to my grandchildren made it worthwhile. At first, things improved. I was invited for Sunday dinners and occasionally asked to babysit. Jessica, now 4, would climb into my lap for stories, and baby Ethan would giggle delightfully when I sang to him. Those moments were pure gold to me. But over time, the invitations dwindled. Heather began finding excuses whenever I called to visit. "We're just so busy this weekend," she would say, her voice tight with forced politeness. "Perhaps next week." Next week rarely came. David stopped taking my calls, responding only to texts, and usually hours later. When I did visit, I noticed disturbing changes in their home. Despite their supposedly tight budget, David drove a brand-new BMW, and Heather showcased designer clothes and jewelry. One afternoon, while babysitting, I accidentally opened a drawer looking for crayons and found documents showing David had invested in a vacation property in Maui and had a separate bank account with over $200,000 in it. The same week, he had asked me to help pay for Jessica's private kindergarten because they were struggling with bills. I confronted David gently during my next visit. "I noticed some investment papers," I said carefully. "I thought you were having financial difficulties." His face darkened with anger. "You had no right to go through our things. Those investments are for the children's future." "But you said you couldn't afford Jessica's school," I pressed. "Our finances are none of your business, Mom," he snapped, then softened slightly at my hurt expression. "Look, real estate investments and daily expenses are different things. It's complicated." I backed down, not wanting to cause friction. But something had changed in our relationship. I began to wonder if I truly knew my son anymore. The most shocking revelation came when I was picking up Jessica from school after Heather called with a migraine. Jessica's teacher, Mrs. Parker, thanked me for the additional payment for the school trip. Jessica was so excited when she found out she could go after all, she said, smiling. "It's wonderful that you were able to cover the fee." Confused, I simply nodded. Later, I asked Jessica about it. "Daddy said we couldn't afford it," she explained innocently. But then he said, "Grandma Eileen paid so I could go." "Thank you, Grandma." I had done no such thing. David had apparently used me as an explanation for changing his mind, but the fact that he initially claimed they couldn't afford a $200 school trip while hiding substantial assets disturbed me deeply. What else was he lying about? And to whom? The day everything changed began ordinarily enough. I had developed a routine of walking near their house when I missed the grandchildren too much. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of Jessica playing in the front yard, or Heather loading the kids into her SUV. I never approached unless invited, respecting the boundaries they had established, no matter how much they hurt. That Tuesday afternoon in April, the spring air was crisp with the promise of warmer days ahead. I noticed Heather's car was gone, but as I passed their house, I distinctly heard crying coming through an open upstairs window. I stopped, listening. It was Jessica, and she sounded distressed, not the typical tantrum of a 6-year-old, but genuine fear or pain. I approached the front door, intending only to ring the bell, but discovered it was ajar about an inch. "Hello?" I called out. "Jessica? Heather?" The crying continued, but no one answered. Concerned, I pushed the door open wider. "Hello? Is anyone home? It's Eileen, Jessica's grandmother." The house was eerily quiet except for Jessica's sobs. The living room was in disarray, with toys scattered across the floor, several glasses half filled with what looked like wine on the coffee table, and a pile of mail spilling onto the floor. This wasn't the meticulously kept home Heather usually maintained. "Jessica, honey? Where are you?" I called, my worry increasing. "Grandma, I'm upstairs." Her voice sounded small and frightened. I hurried up the stairs, following the sound to Jessica's bedroom. The door was closed, and when I tried the handle, I discovered it was locked from the outside with one of those child safety locks. "Jessica, why is your door locked?" I asked, quickly opening it. My granddaughter sat on her bed, tears streaming down her flushed face. Her hair was unwashed and tangled, and she wore the same unicorn pajamas I had seen her in 3 days earlier when I dropped off a birthday gift. "Mommy said I was being too noisy," she explained, rubbing her eyes. "She said I had to stay in my room until she said I could come out. But then she fell asleep. And I need to use the bathroom really bad, and Ethan's crying too." My heart sank as I hugged her and quickly helped her to the bathroom. "Where is Ethan, sweetie?" "In his room. He's been crying for a long time." I found my 4-year-old grandson in similar circumstances, locked in his room, his diaper soaked and clearly unchanged for hours. He was red-faced from crying, his cheeks streaked with dried tears. When he saw me, he lifted his arms desperately. "Gamma," he whimpered, the only version of Grandma he could manage. After changing Ethan and helping both children clean up, I went in search of Heather. I found her passed out on her bed, an empty bottle of wine on the nightstand, alongside an orange prescription bottle with my name on it. My heart nearly stopped when I recognized it as the pain medication I had been prescribed after my knee surgery last year. Several pills were missing. I gently shook Heather awake. She startled, her eyes unfocused, and her speech slurred. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, trying to sit up. "The children were locked in their rooms, Heather. Jessica said they've been there for hours." "Just a nap," she mumbled. "Needed a break." While Heather stumbled to the bathroom, I took the children downstairs and made them lunch. The refrigerator was nearly empty, with only condiments, a half-empty carton of curdled milk, and some withered vegetables. The pantry wasn't much better. "Is Mommy sick again?" Jessica asked as she ate the peanut butter sandwich I'd managed to make. "Again? Does Mommy get sick a lot?" I asked carefully. Jessica nodded solemnly. "She sleeps a lot during the day. Sometimes she forgets to make dinner, and we eat cereal." "And who takes care of you when Mommy is sleeping?" "I take care of Ethan," she said, with the serious pride of a child forced to grow up too quickly. "I'm a big girl." My heart broke at her words. As Jessica ate, I noticed bruises on Ethan's arm, fingerprint-sized marks that suggested he had been grabbed roughly. "Ethan, what happened to your arm, sweetie?" I asked gently. "Mommy mad," was all he said before returning to his sandwich. I felt sick. While the children finished eating, I quietly took photos of the house's condition, the locked doors, the empty kitchen, and discreetly, Ethan's bruises. I also photographed my prescription bottle on Heather's nightstand. When Heather finally came downstairs, she seemed more alert but irritable. "You had no right to just walk into our house," she snapped. The door was open, and Jessica was crying. I replied calmly. "Heather, the children were locked in their rooms. They hadn't been fed. Ethan hadn't been changed." "Don't you dare judge me," she hissed, keeping her voice low but intense. "You have no idea how hard it is to raise 2 children with a husband who's never home." "Is that my prescription bottle upstairs?" I asked directly. She paled slightly. "I found it in the guest bathroom from your last visit. I was going to return it." The lie was so transparent it didn't deserve a response. Instead, I asked, "Where were you planning to get dinner from tonight? There's no food in the house." David is bringing takeout, she said defensively. Look, I appreciate your concern, but you need to leave now. Heather, I think you need help, I said gently. Whatever is going on, the children shouldn't suffer for it. Nothing is going on except you overstepping, as usual, she snapped. Just go. I reluctantly prepared to leave, promising the children I would see them soon. As I reached the door, Jessica grabbed my hand. Please don't go, Grandma, she whispered, her eyes fearful. That moment decided everything for me. Once in my car, I called Child Protective Services. I reported what I had seen and emailed them the photos I had taken. The caseworker assured me they would investigate immediately. 3 hours later, my phone rang. It was David, and he was furious. What the hell do you think you're doing? He shouted without preamble. Social services is at our house. The children were neglected and possibly abused, I said firmly. Heather was incapacitated. She's been stealing my pain medication. That's a damn lie, he snarled. Heather would never. You're just resentful because we don't let you visit whenever you want. David, I saw it with my own eyes. Jessica said this happens regularly. Ethan has bruises. Kids get bruises all the time. You've gone too far, Mom. Way too far. You will not see the children again. I promise you that. The line went dead. I sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down my face. 2 days later, the court summons arrived, accusing me of trespassing, defamation, and interference with parental rights. The weeks following the summons were some of the darkest of my life. David hired Martin Chambers, one of the most expensive attorneys in the state, known for his aggressive tactics and high success rate. I couldn't afford anything close to comparable legal representation on my fixed income. Linda Green, a public defender assigned to my case, was kind, but overwhelmed with work. Our first meeting left me with little hope. Mrs. Nelson, I'll be honest with you, she said, reviewing my file in her cluttered office. Your son has a strong case for trespassing. You entered their home without explicit permission. The door was open, and my granddaughter was crying, I protested. I understand, but legally speaking, that doesn't constitute an invitation to enter. She sighed. And the defamation claim stems from your allegations to CPS. If they don't find clear evidence of abuse or neglect, those claims could be considered defamatory. So I should have left my grandchildren locked in their rooms? Left Ethan in a soiled diaper for hours? Ignored the bruises? My voice rose with indignation. Linda held up a placating hand. I'm not saying what you did was wrong morally. I'm saying it might be difficult to defend legally. Did CPS share their findings with you? They said the investigation is ongoing, but the initial visit didn't find sufficient cause for removal. The memory of that phone call still stung. Apparently, by the time the social worker arrived, David was home, Heather was sober, and the house had been hastily cleaned. My world continued to shrink as David's smear campaign spread through our family. He told everyone I had fabricated abuse allegations because I was bitter about not being included in their lives. My sister Carol, who had initially been my staunchest supporter, began to waver after speaking with David. He sounds so convincing, Eileen, she admitted during our weekly coffee meeting. He says Heather had food poisoning that day and was too sick to get out of bed. He says you exaggerated everything. Do you believe him? I asked, heart sinking. Carol fidgeted with her cup. I don't want to. But you have to admit, you've been unhappy about how little you see the grandkids. And you did give them all that money. So this is about money? You think I made up child neglect because of money? I stood abruptly, nearly knocking over my chair. No, Eileen, wait. I didn't mean it like that. Carol reached for my hand, but I pulled away. I know what I saw, Carol. Those children were neglected. Heather has a problem. And David. I hesitated, the truth painful to speak aloud. David isn't the boy we knew anymore. I walked out, ignoring her calls to come back. That night, alone in my apartment, I hit rock bottom. The walls of framed family photos mocked me. David graduating from law school, his arm around my shoulders. Jessica, as a newborn in my arms. Ethan taking his first steps, reaching for me. In a moment of desperation, I called Thomas Reeves, David's childhood best friend. They had drifted apart after college, but Thomas still lived in town, working as a high school counselor. "Mrs. Nelson?" He sounded surprised to hear from me. "Is everything all right?" I found myself pouring out the whole story. Thomas listened quietly, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "To be honest, I'm not entirely surprised," he said when I finished. David changed a lot during college, became very focused on status and appearances. "He wasn't always like that," I defended automatically. "No, he wasn't," Thomas agreed. "But people change, Mrs. Nelson. The last time we talked, about 5 years ago, he was more concerned about making partner than anything else. He barely mentioned you, or even Heather, who was pregnant at the time. After we hung up, I began searching through old boxes I had brought from my house. Among David's childhood mementos, I found journals and letters that painted a disturbing pattern I had somehow missed. Notes from teachers about David's tendency to blame others for his mistakes. A letter from a college roommate cutting ties because David had taken credit for his work on a joint project. How had I been so blind? Had my love clouded my judgment so completely? As I placed the last box back in the closet, my phone rang with an unknown number. Hesitantly, I answered. "Eileen Nelson? This is Scott Bradley. I believe I'm your nephew." The name took a moment to register. Scott was my brother James's son, who had cut ties with the family 15 years ago after a bitter argument with his father. I had sent birthday cards for years, but they eventually came back marked "Return to Sender." "Scott? Yes, of course. How are you?" I stammered, completely caught off guard. "I'm doing well. I'm an attorney in family court in Portland now." There was a pause. "I heard about your situation with David." "How did you know about that?" I asked, confused. Small legal world. A colleague mentioned a case involving a David Nelson suing his mother. I did some digging. His tone softened. "Aunt Eileen, I'd like to help. I specialize in family law, particularly cases involving child welfare." "Scott, I can't afford proper legal representation," I admitted. "I'm offering my services pro bono. No charge." His voice became determined. "Family hasn't always been good to me, but from what I remember, you were always kind. You deserve proper representation, and if what I've heard is true, those kids might need someone fighting for them." Tears sprang to my eyes. "Why would you do this for me?" "Because 15 years ago, when everyone else in the family sided with my father, you sent me $50 and a note saying you believed in me. It was the only support I got from anyone." His voice cracked slightly. "It's time I returned the favor." For the first time since receiving the summons, I felt a flicker of hope. Scott arrived the next morning, professional in a Navy suit, but with kind eyes that reminded me of his father before bitterness had consumed him. He transformed my tiny dining table into a makeshift legal office, spreading out documents and taking detailed notes as I recounted everything. "The first thing we need to do is gather evidence that supports your observations," Scott explained. "Character witnesses who can vouch for your reliability, documentation of your previous relationship with David and the grandchildren, and ideally, corroboration of the neglect you witnessed." "Where do we start?" I asked, feeling overwhelmed. "With the neighbors," Scott said decisively. "People notice things, especially in suburban neighborhoods." We spent the next 2 days interviewing families on David and Heather's street. Most were reluctant to get involved, but 3 neighbors shared concerning observations. "I've heard the little girl crying at night, standing at her window," said Eleanor Wright, an elderly woman whose bedroom faced Jessica's. "More times than I can count, sometimes for hours." Jim and Sarah Tanner, who lived directly across the street, reluctantly admitted they had considered calling authorities themselves. "Their lawn service comes more regularly than Heather does," Sarah confided. "We've seen her leave the kids alone several times. Once, the little boy was wandering in the front yard in just a diaper at 8 in the morning. No adult in sight." "Did you report it?" Scott asked. Jim shook his head. "David's a lawyer. We didn't want trouble." Next, Scott arranged meetings with Jessica's teachers and Ethan's preschool instructors. Mrs. Parker, Jessica's kindergarten teacher, provided a written statement documenting her concerns. Jessica often comes to school in unwashed clothes. She falls asleep in class regularly, suggesting irregular bedtimes. She hoards food from lunch in her backpack, which can indicate food insecurity at home. The preschool was more cautious, but confirmed that Ethan was frequently picked up late, sometimes by a clearly impaired Heather. The director documented 3 occasions when Mrs. Nelson appeared intoxicated, Scott told me after his meeting. They warned her about driving with Ethan in that condition. Each piece of evidence strengthened our case, but broke my heart further. How long had this been happening while I remained unaware? The most difficult part of preparation was gathering personal evidence against my own son. I provided Scott with copies of bank statements showing the money I had given them, texts from David requesting financial help while hiding his assets, and the photos I had taken during my visit. "We should also get your medical records," Scott suggested, "to establish that prescription was legitimately yours and to document how many pills you were prescribed versus how many remained in the bottle you found." As our case built, David's legal team escalated their tactics. I received a formal cease and desist letter, demanding I stay at least 500 feet from their property. My sister Carol called to tell me David had shown her supposed psychological evaluations, suggesting I was suffering from early dementia and paranoia. "He had papers, Eileen. Doctor's letterhead and everything," she said, her voice tinged with doubt. "Carol, I haven't seen any psychiatrist," I insisted. "Those papers are fake." The pressure became more intense when David attempted to approach me directly. He arrived at my apartment unannounced one evening, looking immaculate in an expensive suit but with shadows under his eyes. "Mom," he said when I opened the door, "we need to talk." I hesitated but let him in, leaving the door ajar as Scott had advised if David ever contacted me. He sat stiffly on my sofa, declining my offer of tea. "This has gotten out of hand," he began, his tone reasonable and measured. "I'm willing to drop the lawsuit if you'll sign a statement, retracting your claims to CPS and agreeing to supervised visitation with the children." "Supervised by whom?" I asked. "By Heather, or myself, of course." I studied my son's face, searching for the boy I had raised. "And if I refuse?" His expression hardened. "Then we proceed to court, where I'll have no choice but to present evidence of your mental decline. It won't just be the loss of visitation rights, Mom. I'll petition for a competency hearing. You could lose control of your finances, your independence. The threat hung in the air between us. Are you blackmailing me, David?" "I'm offering you a dignified way out," he countered smoothly. "Think about it. Do you really want to be declared incompetent at your age? To be placed in a facility where strangers manage your affairs?" I felt a chill at his calculating tone. This was not my son speaking. This was a stranger wearing his face. The David I raised would never threaten his mother this way, I said quietly. Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps shame, but it vanished quickly. The mother I knew would never have interfered in my family. Those children are my family too. He stood abruptly. You have 24 hours to decide. After that, we go forward with everything we have. After he left, I called Scott immediately. He arrived within 30 minutes, concerned by the shakiness in my voice. He threatened to have me declared incompetent, I explained, still trembling. Scott's expression darkened. That's actually helpful for us. It demonstrates witness intimidation. He took detailed notes of the conversation. We should accelerate our timeline. I'd like to file some motions tomorrow that might change the dynamic. The next day brought an unexpected breakthrough. Scott had submitted records requests to David's law firm as part of our defense preparation. A partner from the firm, Lawrence Wilson, requested a confidential meeting. In the sterile conference room of a nearby hotel, Lawrence revealed why. We've been conducting an internal investigation of David for several months, he explained gravely. There are discrepancies in client billing and trust accounts. Substantial ones. Are you suggesting my son has been embezzling? I asked, horrified. Lawrence's expression was grim. We're still determining the extent, but yes, funds have been diverted to personal accounts. When we received your attorney's records request, certain patterns became clear. He hesitated. Mrs. Nelson, I'm sharing this in strict confidence because it may be relevant to your case. Our firm will be taking separate legal action. As we left the meeting, Scott was energized. This changes everything. If David has been embezzling, it explains why he's so desperate to discredit you. You're the only one who's seen behind the curtain of his perfect life. I never wanted any of this, I said, feeling hollow at the revelation. I know, Scott said gently. But sometimes the truth has to come out before healing can begin. The day of the hearing arrived with a surreal quality. I had barely slept, my mind cycling through all possible outcomes. Would the judge believe me? Would I ever see my grandchildren again? Would David really try to have me declared incompetent? The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined from television shows, but imposing nonetheless with its dark wood paneling and formal atmosphere. I sat beside Scott at the defendant's table, trying to appear calm while my heart raced. When David and Heather entered with their attorney, I barely recognized them. Heather looked immaculate in a conservative blue dress, her hair pulled back in a modest bun, presenting the image of a perfect mother. Gone was any trace of the disheveled, impaired woman I had found that day. David looked equally polished in an expensive suit, projecting confidence and professional success. As Judge Eleanor Simmons entered, a stern woman in her 60s with piercing eyes that seemed to miss nothing, the proceedings began. Martin Chambers presented their case first, painting me as an interfering, mentally declining mother who couldn't accept my adult son's boundaries. Mrs. Nelson sold her home and expected to be repaid with unlimited access to her son's family, Chambers said smoothly. When that expectation wasn't met, she began fabricating concerns about the children's welfare. David took the stand first, his testimony well rehearsed. He described my increasing erratic behavior, my obsession with the grandchildren, and my unannounced visits despite their requests for scheduled time only. We tried to accommodate her, Your Honor, David said, his voice tinged with practiced regret. But her demands became unreasonable. She would call 10 times a day, show up unannounced, question our parenting decisions. And the day in question, Chambers prompted, April 18th. David's expression hardened. My wife had food poisoning. She was extremely ill, but trying to care for the children. My mother entered our home without permission, took photos of our private space, and called authorities with false allegations that have damaged our reputations. Heather's testimony followed the same narrative. She described herself as a devoted mother struggling with a difficult mother-in-law. She categorically denied any substance abuse issues, explaining the prescription bottle as a mistake. "I found it in the guest bathroom and meant to return it," she said, echoing her earlier explanation to me. "I would never take someone else's medication." Their case seemed airtight. They even brought in 3 character witnesses: a partner from David's firm who praised his work ethic and integrity, a church friend who described Heather's volunteer work with children, and a neighbor who claimed never to have seen any concerning behavior from either of them. When it was our turn, Scott approached the case differently than I expected. Rather than attacking David and Heather directly, he built a careful portrait of the actual situation through independent witnesses. Mrs. Parker testified about Jessica's concerning behavior at school. The preschool director confirmed the incidents of Heather's apparent intoxication when picking up Ethan. The neighbors described the children's apparent neglect. When I finally took the stand, Scott guided me through my testimony with precision. I described my relationship with David before and after his marriage, the financial support I had provided, and the gradual restriction of my access to the grandchildren. I detailed exactly what I had found that April day, without embellishment or emotional flourish. "And why did you call Child Protective Services?" Scott asked. "Because I believed the children were in danger," I said simply. "Jessica told me she was often left alone to care for Ethan. There was no food in the house. Ethan had bruises consistent with being grabbed too hard. My prescription medication was in Heather's possession. I was afraid for them." During cross-examination, Chambers attempted to portray me as confused and vindictive, but Scott had prepared me well. I remained calm and consistent. The most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Judge Simmons had appointed a guardian ad litem, Patricia Lopez, to interview Jessica independently. Her report was damning. "Jessica confirms that she is often left alone with her younger brother," Patricia stated. She described being locked in her room as punishment for making noise and going without meals when her mother takes her nap medicine and forgets to wake up. These statements were made consistently across 3 separate interviews. As the evidence mounted, I noticed Lawrence Wilson enter the courtroom and speak briefly with the bailiff. Moments later, the bailiff approached Judge Simmons, who nodded and called for a 15-minute recess. When court resumed, Judge Simmons announced, "The court has been informed that there is additional evidence pertinent to this case. Mr. Lawrence Wilson has requested permission to testify." David visibly paled as his firm's senior partner took the stand. Lawrence outlined the ongoing investigation into financial irregularities at the firm, specifically naming David as the subject of that investigation. "We have documented evidence that Mr. Nelson has diverted approximately $300,000 from client accounts over the past 2 years," Lawrence testified. "The pattern of withdrawals correlates with Mrs. Will, Nelson's timeline of increasing issues in the home." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. David leaned over to Chambers, speaking urgently. Heather stared at David with dawning horror on her face. When order was restored, Chambers requested a brief conference with his clients. After several tense minutes of whispered conversation, they returned to their table. David's confident facade had cracked, revealing panic underneath. "Your Honor," Chambers began carefully, "in light of this new information, my clients would like to amend their testimony." What followed was the most shocking moment of the hearing. David, apparently attempting to salvage his reputation and career, turned on Heather. Your Honor, I've recently become aware of my wife's substance abuse issues, he said, his voice steady despite Heather's audible gasp beside him. I travel frequently for work and wasn't fully aware of the conditions at home during my absences. I believe my mother may have witnessed genuine neglect, but it was not with my knowledge or consent. Heather's face contorted with rage and betrayal. You knew, she shouted, jumping to her feet. You've been giving me those pills for months. You said they would help with my anxiety. The bailiff moved quickly to restore order as Judge Simmons called for another recess. Scott squeezed my hand under the table. He's throwing her under the bus to save himself, he whispered. I watched my son avoid eye contact with everyone, including his now sobbing wife. The little boy I had raised, who had once cried over injured birds and shared his lunch with classmates who forgot theirs, had become someone I couldn't recognize. The unexpected recess extended to a full hour as Judge Simmons reviewed the new evidence and testimonies in her chambers. The courtroom remained tense, with David and Heather now sitting at opposite ends of their table, refusing to look at each other. When proceedings resumed, Judge Simmons announced she would hear closing arguments, followed by additional testimony from any party wishing to amend their statements in light of the revelations. Martin Chambers went first, his confident demeanor noticeably diminished. He attempted to separate David's professional issues from the family matter at hand, arguing that alleged financial improprieties had no bearing on his client's parenting abilities. Mr. Nelson has acknowledged his wife may have issues requiring professional help, Chambers concluded, but he remains a devoted father committed to his children's welfare. Scott's closing argument was measured and precise. He didn't need to attack. The facts now spoke for themselves. Your Honor, this case began as an attempt to silence a concerned grandmother who witnessed neglect and took appropriate action. The evidence clearly shows Mrs. Nelson's concerns were valid and her actions reasonable. The children's welfare must be the court's primary consideration. Judge Simmons then asked if anyone wished to provide additional testimony. To everyone's surprise, Heather requested to speak. Her earlier polished appearance had crumbled. Mascara streaked her cheeks, and her hands trembled as she took the stand. I've been struggling, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. After Ethan was born, I had postpartum depression. David was working 70-hour weeks. I started having trouble sleeping, then anxiety attacks. She glanced at David with a mixture of anger and hurt. David brought home pills, said they were from the office first aid kit just to help me sleep. When those ran out, he brought others. I didn't know they were Eileen's prescription at first. She took a shaky breath. Things got out of control. I'd take pills to sleep, then more to get through the day. I started drinking to manage the side effects. Her testimony continued, revealing a household in distress. David was rarely home, focused on his career advancement. The children became secondary to his ambitions. He controlled all finances, providing Heather with a minimal allowance while presenting the image of success to colleagues and family. He knew I wasn't coping, she said, but appearances mattered more than getting me real help. Following Heather's testimony, Judge Simmons called for a court-appointed child welfare expert to interview both children immediately. Court would reconvene the following day after the expert's assessment. Outside the courtroom, Scott was optimistic. This is going much better than expected. Heather's testimony corroborated everything you witnessed. I felt no triumph, only sadness. Those poor children, I said, and Heather needs help, not punishment. That evening, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. I opened it to find Lawrence Wilson, David's firm's senior partner. Mrs. Nelson, I apologize for the intrusion, he said formally. There's something you should know before tomorrow's proceedings. He handed me a folder. These were found during our audit of David's computer. I've provided copies to the court and your attorney, but thought you should see them personally. Inside were printouts of emails between David and his secretary, Melissa Granger. The messages outlined a plan for after the court case. David would gain full custody, send Heather to a rehabilitation facility, and place the children in an exclusive boarding school that accepted students as young as 4. Meanwhile, he and Melissa would continue their apparently ongoing affair while maintaining the appearance of a devoted single father. Most devastating was an email where David discussed continuing to request financial support from me, his reliable cash cow, who would be grateful for occasional FaceTime calls with the kids. I sat heavily on the sofa, the papers trembling in my hands. Lawrence watched me with genuine sympathy. "I've known David since he joined our firm," he said quietly. "He was always ambitious, but something changed these past few years. The man in those emails isn't someone our firm can continue to employ." The final day of the hearing began with the child welfare expert's report. Dr. Julia Hammond had spent 3 hours with Jessica and Ethan the previous afternoon. Her assessment was clear and disturbing. "Both children show signs of neglect and emotional distress," she testified. "Jessica has taken on inappropriate caretaking responsibilities for her age. Ethan displays attachment issues consistent with inconsistent parenting. Neither child appears to have a secure bond with their father, describing him as always working or on the computer. Their bond with their grandmother, however, is strong and positive." When asked for her recommendation, Dr. Hammond was unequivocal. "The children need stability and consistent care. Based on my observations and the evidence presented, I believe Mrs. Nelson is currently best positioned to provide that environment." David looked stunned at the suggestion. When given opportunity to address the court, he attempted to reassert control. "Your Honor, I acknowledge mistakes were made," he began smoothly. "I failed to recognize the extent of my wife's issues. I work demanding hours to provide for my family. But I am these children's father. I am prepared to hire appropriate child care and ensure they receive the best possible upbringing." Judge Simmons interrupted him. "Mr. Nelson, the court has received additional evidence regarding your intentions for the children should you retain custody. Are you familiar with the Brentwood Academy?" David faltered. "I've researched several educational options, including boarding schools for children as young as 4? The judge pressed. He had no answer. I requested to address the court one final time. Judge Simmons granted permission, and I approached the stand with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. "Your Honor, I didn't come to court seeking custody," I began. "I came because I saw children in trouble and did what any grandmother would do, what any decent person would do." I looked directly at David. "I still love my son, even now. I love Heather too, despite everything. Most of all, I love Jessica and Ethan. They deserve better than they've received." I took a deep breath. "I'm not interested in punishment. I'm interested in healing. Heather needs treatment, not condemnation. David needs to recognize what truly matters. And the children need stability and love." My voice remained steady. "I'm prepared to provide whatever support the court deems appropriate to ensure those children's well-being." As I returned to my seat, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: respect in Judge Simmons's eyes. Judge Simmons did not immediately issue her ruling after closing arguments. Instead, she called for a 30-minute recess to review all evidence one final time. The courtroom waited in tense silence for her return. When she finally took her seat, her expression was grave but resolved. "This court's primary concern is the welfare of minor children Jessica and Ethan Nelson," she began. Having reviewed all testimony and evidence, I find clear and convincing evidence that both children have been subjected to neglect and emotional harm in their parents' home. David stiffened beside his attorney. Heather's shoulders slumped further. Mrs. Heather Nelson requires immediate intervention for substance abuse issues that have impaired her ability to parent effectively. Mr. David Nelson has demonstrated patterns of deception, financial impropriety, and a concerning prioritization of appearances over his children's actual well-being. Judge Simmons looked directly at my son. Mr. Nelson, this court is deeply troubled by evidence suggesting you were aware of your wife's impairment, yet continued to leave your children in her care while you pursued career advancement and extramarital affairs. Further, your apparent willingness to place your very young children in boarding school while maintaining the illusion of dedicated fatherhood speaks to a profound failure of parental responsibility. David's face flushed, but he remained silent. Therefore, this court orders the following. Temporary custody of Jessica and Ethan Nelson is awarded to their grandmother, Mrs. Eileen Nelson, for a period of 6 months, during which both parents will have supervised visitation rights contingent upon their compliance with court-ordered interventions. She turned to Heather. Mrs. Nelson, you will enter a 30-day inpatient rehabilitation program, followed by intensive outpatient treatment and parenting classes. To David, she continued, Mr. Nelson, you will attend weekly therapy focusing on family obligations and appropriate parenting, complete 60 hours of community service with a child welfare organization, and submit to financial oversight regarding all expenditures related to your children. She paused, her gaze intensifying. Mr. Nelson, I want to be absolutely clear. Your priority as a father must be your children's well-being, not your career, not your reputation, and certainly not the appearance of perfection at the expense of actual care. The judge then addressed me. Mrs. Eileen Nelson, this court finds your actions were reasonable and appropriate given the circumstances you observed. Your complaint is dismissed with prejudice, and Mr. David Nelson is ordered to pay all legal costs associated with this matter. She gathered her papers. One final note. Mr. Nelson, you came to this court seeking to silence your mother and preserve an illusion of family perfection. Instead, this proceeding has revealed the truth of your priorities and choices. The court sincerely hopes this serves as a wake-up call. Looking directly at David, she delivered the words that would stay with me forever. Mr. Nelson, as both an attorney and a father, you should understand that true family is not measured by appearances or possessions, but by protection, sacrifice, and genuine care. Your mother demonstrated those qualities when she risked her relationship with you to protect your children. You demonstrated the opposite when you chose to prioritize your image over their welfare. The most important case you will ever argue is not in this courtroom, but in the hearts and memories of your children. Right now, sir, you are losing that case badly. The silence that followed was profound. David sat frozen, his carefully constructed world visibly crumbling around him. The aftermath of the hearing unfolded gradually over the following months. Jessica and Ethan moved into my apartment temporarily, while I searched for a more suitable home for the three of us. Their transition was both heartbreaking and healing to witness. "Do we have to go back to Mommy and Daddy?" Jessica asked the first night, her small voice trembling as I tucked her into bed in my spare room. "Your Mommy and Daddy are getting help right now," I explained gently. "They love you very much, but they need to learn some new ways to take care of you. Until then, you'll stay with Grandma." The relief in her eyes spoke volumes about what she had endured. Heather entered rehabilitation the following week. To everyone's surprise, she embraced the program fully, later explaining that it was her first opportunity to address issues that had been building for years. Without David's controlling presence, and with proper medical support, she began to rediscover herself. David's journey was more complicated. The law firm terminated his employment following the discovery of financial improprieties. Criminal charges were deferred conditional upon full restitution of misappropriated funds. His initial reaction was anger and denial, blaming everyone but himself for his circumstances. 3 weeks after the hearing, he appeared at my door unannounced. His appearance had changed dramatically. Gone were the expensive suit and carefully styled hair. He looked younger somehow, dressed in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, his eyes lacking their usual calculating gleam. "Can I see them?" he asked simply. "They're napping," I replied, not yet ready to welcome him fully. "Court says visits need to be supervised and scheduled." He nodded, accepting the boundary. "I deserved what the judge said," he admitted, the words clearly difficult for him. "I've lost everything, Mom. My job, my reputation. Even Melissa left once the money dried up. What about your children, David? Have you lost them too?" His eyes filled with tears. "I hope not. I don't know how to be a good father. I never had one." He looked away. "But I'd like to learn, if it's not too late." It was the first honest thing he'd said to me in years. 2 months later, we found a small 3-bedroom house with a fenced yard, using some of the money David had been ordered to repay me. The children blossomed in their new environment, gradually leaving behind the anxious behaviors they had developed. Jessica no longer felt responsible for caring for her brother. Ethan's vocabulary expanded rapidly once he received consistent attention. Heather completed her inpatient program and began supervised visits, bringing crafts and books rather than expensive toys. The children were cautious at first, but slowly warmed to her genuine efforts. "Thank you," she said to me after one visit, as the children played in the yard, "for not hating me, for giving me another chance with them." "We all deserve second chances," I told her, "especially when we're truly trying to change." David's transformation was slower but equally sincere. His therapist helped him recognize the roots of his materialism and status obsession. He found work at a small legal aid office, making a fraction of his previous salary, but doing meaningful work for the first time in his career. At the 6-month hearing, Judge Simmons reviewed the progress of both parents. Heather had maintained sobriety, completed parenting classes, and secured part-time work. David had fulfilled all court requirements and demonstrated consistent commitment to supervised visitation. "The court is encouraged by these developments," Judge Simmons noted. "However, children need stability above all. Therefore, primary physical custody will remain with Mrs. Eileen Nelson for an additional 6 months, with expanded unsupervised visitation for both parents contingent upon continued compliance." Outside the courtroom, David approached me. "That seems fair," he said, without the resentment I might have expected. "The kids are happy with you. Stable. They miss their parents," I told him honestly. "The real versions of you, not the people you were pretending to be." He nodded thoughtfully. "I'm trying to find that person again. The one you raised." He hesitated. "I'm sorry, Mom, for everything. For the money, the lies, for trying to keep you from the kids. Most of all, for failing them." "You haven't failed yet," I said. "You're still writing their story, our story." 1 year after that terrible day when I found Jessica crying behind a locked door, we celebrated Ethan's 5th birthday in my backyard. David grilled hamburgers, while Heather, now 9 months sober, organized games. My sister Carol helped Jessica decorate cupcakes in the kitchen. Scott, who had remained a friend to all of us, brought his wife and children to join the celebration. As I watched my family, imperfect but healing, I reflected on everything we had endured. The money and possessions that had seemed so important to David now meant nothing compared to the genuine laughter of his children. Heather's designer clothes had been replaced by simple jeans and a happiness that made her truly beautiful, and I had discovered a strength in myself I never knew existed. That evening, after the children were asleep, David, Heather, and I sat on the porch, swing together. "The judge was right," David said quietly, "about what really matters." "We still have a long way to go," Heather acknowledged. I took both their hands in mine. "But we're going there together. That's what family really means." The road ahead would still have challenges. Trust rebuilds slowly, and old habits die hard. But watching the stars appear above us, I felt peace settle over my heart. Sometimes love means fighting for what matters, even when that fight takes you to unexpected battlegrounds. Sometimes the hardest battles lead to the most meaningful victories. And sometimes the family you save might be your own. If you've ever had to make difficult choices to protect those you love, I'd love to hear about your experience in the comments below. Have you had to stand up to family members for the sake of children or others who couldn't defend themselves? Like this video if you believe in fighting for what's right, even when it's painful. Subscribe for more stories about family, courage, and doing the right thing even when it costs you. And please share this story with anyone who might be struggling with similar difficult choices in their own families. Thank you for listening, and remember that true strength isn't about power or control, but about love and protection, even when it breaks your heart.